using, common language, some reminders, fiscal reminders, data reminders, a couple of new resources, and then some upcoming things. I want to again talk about the difference between instruction that we provided last spring, or those learning opportunities. If I could get everybody to mute, please. And I don't know what to call it other than real instruction. So real instruction is what we typically see prior to COVID in a face-to-face model, although we do have virtual schools that deliver real instruction. It's standards-based, it's high quality, it's rigorous, and real instruction needs to be delivered regardless of how you're delivering it, whether you're delivering it face-to-face, through a hybrid model or a virtual model. Real instruction is our the curriculum, the standards that we're teaching, and those types of things. Again, I would welcome anyone to please, if we can come up with a better term than real instruction, I'd love it. Emergency instruction is what we refer to as what we had to drop back to and do last spring when we originally closed school buildings. It was the emergency deployment of continued learning opportunities, whether that was in through packets that were delivered, paper and pencil packets, or remote learning or distance learning, or whatever we had to do. It was short term, although I know that the months of March, April, and May, as we lived through those, seemed to last a lifetime. It was temporary until we got real instruction in this new now figured out. It was delivered as a response to an emergency situation, and we did that through contingency plans. So the main thing I want to talk about is the difference between when you need a real IEP and when you need a contingency plan. A real IEP is needed for a student to access real instruction. The contingency plan would be used for short-term emergency situation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So our instructional delivery models, all of your districts had to turn in a reopening of school plan. All the plans had to describe how you were going to provide real instruction, standards-based, high-quality instruction, whether it was a face-to-face model, a hybrid model that would combine face-to-face and virtual, whether it was virtual synchronous, virtual asynchronous, or a combination of all of the above. If we're talking about real instruction, standards-based, high-quality instruction, that needs an IEP in place. When we're talking about the types of services, we're talking about academic recovery services, and these are the services that are needed by all students because of the school closures that began in March. And the purpose of academic recovery is to provide an opportunity to address the unfinished learning that all students had from the spring. And you all know we've got students that had more unfinished learning than others did. The focus for academic recovery should be on the recovery of the priority standards to ensure that all students will be able to pick up and continue in the learning progression at the next level, whether it's the next grade level or however we're moving students on in the progression. So the process of academic recovery is going to be ongoing. We had some districts offered the LEAP days to start this process. This is not going to be something that we can recover from in 5 days, a week, a month. This academic recovery And when I say academic, I am enfolding the whole school experience because social emotional is such a big part of this. But the recovery from what we experienced in the spring is going to be ongoing and will last longer for some students than for others. Supplemental school closure services may be necessary depending on how the student with disabilities accessed the school day and the remote or the emergency learning opportunities that were provided. These will be provided for some students with disabilities because of the lack of expected progress during the closure. Some of our kids with disabilities were able to pick up, and with the support they received from special education teachers and staff, and go on and access whatever the district was providing without missing a beat. We had other students that were not able to access in that same manner. So you're going to be looking to see what services, in addition to the academic recovery services, these students need in order to be able to pick up and continue working on their new IEP goals. Compensatory services would be determined by an IEP team when special education services were unavailable. The district just plain could not provide them during this time. Typically, compensatory services are provided as a result of a denial of FAPE, and they're intended to close the gap between where the student should have been if he or she had received the special ed services and where the student is currently functioning. Contingency plan services are intended to describe the reasonable and practical services that are needed by a student with a disability during a temporary emergency school closure when the school or district is unable to provide real instruction. And again, I apologize for using that term. I'd love to come up with another one, but if we face another situation where a class or a school or a district has to close and is not able to provide that standards-based high-quality instruction in another instructional format, and the school or district has to drop back to providing those continued learning opportunities, then you're going to need a contingency plan that talks about how the student will be able to access those continued learning opportunities. The contingency plan is designed to be used for short-term emergency closures to describe how the school or district will make reasonable and practical efforts to provide access to the continued learning opportunities. So the instruction itself determines what services are needed and which plan. If all students are going to receive real instruction, that standards-based, high-quality, traditional instruction, if we want to call it that, regardless of the delivery model, if your district or your school is able to switch from face-to-face to hybrid to virtual at the drop of a hat, and continue to provide that traditional high quality instruction, then the IEP has to be designed to enable the child to appropriately advance toward IEP goals, to be involved in and make progress in the Gen Ed curriculum, to participate in extracurricular and other activities, to be educated and participate with non-disabled students to the maximum extent possible. In other words, to receive FAPE. So if your district is providing traditional standards-based high-quality instruction, regardless of the service delivery model, then that's going to require a real IEP. So if you have a situation in your district that's going to require a school or the whole district to flip from, for example, flip from face-to-face or hybrid to completely virtual, and you're going to continue providing high quality instruction in that virtual format, then that's got to be handled through a real IEP.
And that's what we do.
If you'll mute, if I could get everybody to mute, please. So the form that we provided, and thank you again to Greenville for developing this and allowing us to adapt it and share it. That's a form that you can use. It's optional. It's not a requirement. That's a form that you could use to document what that instruction would look like if that student had to flip from one service delivery model to another. So for example, if you are anticipating opening face-to-face, you've got your IEP in place anyway. If you've given parents the choice between face-to-face or hybrid, then you've got to have an IEP that's going to address what that student, what special ed services that student needs if the student's in a hybrid model, or if that student is in a virtual model. And this is just one way that we thought would be easy for districts to be able to switch between models if we're faced with that situation. Now, you certainly can, you always have the option of having an IEP meeting or doing an amendment without a meeting every time that student might switch. That's always an option. We were just trying to come up with a way for parents and IEP teams to be able to kind of look down the road this year and think, where might we be faced with changes in the instructional delivery model, and how could we provide clear documentation across all of these delivery models for parents and staff without having to have an actual IEP meeting every time we might need to make a change. But again, you always have the option of, if a parent switches from one model to another, or if your district has to switch from hybrid to all virtual, you certainly can have IEP meetings. The documentation form was simply a way for us to try to save the IEP team some time, but clearly make sure everyone understands what the IEP would look like across those delivery models. So if you choose to use this form, once you complete it, you could upload that and you'd have that with your prior written notice, and that would take care of the year, unless of course the student's not making progress and you need to have an IEP meeting, or there's another reason to have an IEP meeting. But changes in across real instruction, if it's the service delivery model, regardless of the service delivery model, you've got to have an IEP in place. If I could ask everybody to mute your phone or your computer, please.
Hey, open it up and see, because I think it's probably something somebody thinks it's for special ed.
If I could get everybody to mute, please. Now, if we have a short-term emergency closure, if the school grade class would need to close because of an emergency, and you're not able to provide real traditional instruction, even in another format, you're going to have to go back to providing that emergency deployment of continued instructional opportunities. That's where you could use the contingency plan. The sample that Greenville provided has a place for the contingency plan on it, so you could use that. We also were able to work with Enrich to get a contingency plan in the update that just came out with Enrich. You can use either of those or develop your own. You just need some way to document what accessibility and how students with disabilities are going to access the emergency deployment of continued learning opportunities. If you choose, when you're looking at Enrich, if you're going to use another format to develop a contingency plan, when it comes up with the question of does the student need a contingency plan, you can say no, it won't affect, it should not affect anything else in the IEP. We are still working on a couple of bugs, but if you're choosing to use another way to develop a contingency plan, you can say no. Or if you're confident that your district is going to be able to continue real traditional instruction, even if it's in a different delivery model. So if you're in a hybrid model and something happens and your district needs to flip to all virtual, you can put no for the contingency plan and you don't need a contingency plan. So again, if your district is going to be able to continue real traditional instruction, regardless of what happens, you don't need a contingency plan. You only need the contingency plan if you're going to have to drop back to that emergency, whatever we called what we provided in the spring. So this slide is just kind of the comparison of when you need an IEP, when you might need a contingency plan. With an IEP, that's when you're providing standards-based, high-quality instruction to all students. The IEP would be applicable across all instructional delivery models, so you would need an IEP regardless of whether the student was getting this high-quality instruction face-to-face or hybrid or virtual. And it would be, the IEP, of course, would document, you could use that documentation form if you choose to document what it would look like across all the service delivery options. Or again, you can hold IEP meetings each time a student was to flip between models. The contingency plan will only be needed for emergency short-term closures if we experience any of those again. And it's instruction, so if instruction for all students change and we're no longer delivering real high-quality standards-based instruction to all students for a short-term period because of an emergency, then you would need a contingency plan. I was able late last week to participate in a national SPED directors call with Laurie Vanderploeg, who is over the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Ed. And I was so glad to hear some of the things that she was saying. And we'll talk specifically about a couple of those in just a moment, but she really reinforced the fact that health and safety needs continue to drive every decision we make. And that's got to be at the forefront of what we're deciding and how we're deciding. And it's the health and safety needs of our students, our families, and our staff. Regardless of the instructional model, students with disabilities retain their right to receive a FAPE and be educated in the least restrictive environment. So there is no lessening of the requirement for FAPE in a virtual setting, a hybrid setting, face-to-face setting. Communication continues to be critical. One of the things that Laurie Vanderploeg said was that she had been meeting with some of the parent training centers across the nation, and they were hearing from parents that they've heard nothing at all from their district about what reopening will look like. I feel like we have made every attempt possible to communicate. All the districts have done a great job in communicating what reopening will look like, when decisions will be made, but that communication continues to be critical. I truly feel like we have a leg up in special education with communication, because that is such a critical, integral part of what we do, that parent communication, that parent engagement. So again, communication continues to be critical, and support and training for our staff, our parents, and students may be needed in order for them to access the instructional delivery model, or for our kids to make progress this year. Opening of school this year is looking different than it ever has. And a lot of the things that we've taken for granted and that we've kind of gotten used to doing habitually, with opening school, with teaching, setting up our classrooms, setting up meetings, we're going to need to do differently. And as I'm sure you found out, some of our parents, staff, and students are going to need more support through this than others. So just a couple of reminders. An IEP has to be in place for all students with disabilities. The IEP has to reflect the district's offer of FAPE for the student. FAPE can be and must be provided across all the different instructional delivery models. The IEP determines how the student's disability impacts his or her access to the general curriculum and what his or her needs are as a result of that disability. FAPE has to be provided consistent with the need to protect health and safety of students, families, and staff. Again, health and safety have to drive all of our decisions. Another reminder is that if all students are in a home setting, this becomes the gen ed setting. Or if the majority of the home setting, unless it is an IEP home-based decision or medical homebound, if a student is doing hybrid or virtually, that is the gen ed setting for that student. Asynchronous instruction is direct instruction. So think of asynchronous instruction as being that's your recorded lesson that you've provided, and with that, you're including practice time, independent work time for the students, just like in a classroom when the teacher provides instruction to the group and then gives the students time to work in a small group or independently. That's how you're going to think about asynchronous instruction when you're looking at minutes. Also take into consideration how you're going to involve the parent in the student's learning and instruction, and all of that becomes part of the students' minutes or time spent with when we're talking about special education services. One of the questions that we've gotten a fair amount has to do with mainstreaming. And I think what we have to do is to remember what the intention of mainstreaming is. It's intentionally providing instruction and interacting with students, for our students with disabilities, with their non-disabled peers. The determining factor for mainstreaming isn't really who's providing the instruction, and it's not even necessarily what the instruction is, but rather it's with whom is the student receiving that instruction. One of the challenges we're going to have is that some of our schools are using the community or family model, where the students stay in a classroom and teachers come in and out. This really is going to require some creativity and some thinking on the part of IEP teams to look at what might be appropriate for mainstreaming. The instruction, even if it's gen ed instruction and it's provided by a gen ed teacher, if it's provided to the student with a disability who's sitting in a classroom with other students with disabilities, in other words, a self-contained classroom, this may not meet the definition of least restrictive environment with non-disabled peers. Again, it's got to be an individual student decision based on why that student or why that team determined that child needed to be in the mainstream and have that instruction with non-disabled peers. Your pre and post assessment data that's required by the legislature is going to be critical this year. if you'll think of pre-assessment data as kind of your new baseline, that's where you're going to compare it to where the student was when in-person services stopped in March. So you're going to look at where the student was. And if you've got your formative assessment data at the end of the year, you're going to have data on where the student was at the end of the year. So your pre-assessment is kind of going to be your new baseline data. As with any formative assessment, best practice would say that you're going to progress monitor along the way to see how that student is responding to recovery services, to new instruction, and you're going to make decisions based on that progress monitoring data throughout the fall. Your post-assessment data will kind of be your benchmark of has the student been able to recover and move on with new learning goals in the IEP and continue to move on at the next level. Another reminder with this is virtual discipline issues. Yes, there can be discipline issues in a virtual setting, and I hear all of my friends from the virtual charter schools laughing when I say this. But there can be discipline issues in a virtual setting. Think about the definition of a disciplinary removal. Our definition is the removal of a student from the instructional setting that he or she is typically in, and you're removing him due to disciplinary reasons. So if you kick a kid out of your Zoom room because he's making inappropriate comments in the chat box, this may be a disciplinary removal. And these are some of the things that we're going to need to flesh out as we go along with this new way of providing instruction. And again, where we really will rely on our friends that have been doing this kind of virtual instruction for a while. But just keep in mind that it is not true that there are no discipline problems in a virtual setting. Yet, and that you can't suspend or expel a child from a virtual setting. So here's something that came directly from Laurie Vanderploeg, the Assistant Secretary at OSEP. And we've talked about this. We talked about this in an LEA call earlier in the year about what might it look like if in a virtual setting, the time or the amount of gen ed instruction for all students has been removed. How might this affect students with disabilities? We said at that time that because it cannot be a direct proportion, that we were not going to put out a chart that said if instead of 7 hours of gen ed instruction in a virtual setting, the kid's only getting 4, that could be a 4/7. That was a bad example. A 4/7 of instruction for special ed. That's not the way we can automatically think about it. But the question was asked to Laurie Vanderploeg, if the time or amount of gen ed instruction for all students has been reduced, is it appropriate to assume that the time and amount of special education services for a student might be reduced? And the answer is our favorite one of all times. It depends. It can't be, it's not going to be exactly proportionate. It has to be individually determined based on how that student needs to access the instruction. If I could get folks to mute.
I'm here. I'm hanging out.
For some students with disabilities, their special ed time might actually be less than it is if they can access without that level of special ed support in the virtual setting. For other students, it might be more than what they would have received in a face-to-face setting. But I was glad to hear her openly talk about the fact that you've got to look at what the student is getting in gen ed instruction first and make decisions based on that. Again, it can't just automatically be a proportionate reduction. We may have some students with very mild disabilities that face-to-face were getting minimal support, but in a virtual setting, because of their disability, might need much more special education service and support. We may have other kids with disabilities that, because of the instructional format, the instructional delivery model, might need less special education services to access the gen ed instruction. This is where we're really going to be challenged with almost forgetting what we know or have always done with special ed. We've gotten real comfortable to say, you know, in a 7-hour day, a 35-hour week, if we're getting one period of, you know, if we've got 7 periods a day of gen ed and 1 period of special ed, that's going to be an automatic 250 minutes of special ed. We've got to go back to what an IEP was intended to do, and that's to provide access to the general curriculum for a student. The other thing Laurie really reinforced is that there is nothing in IDEA that says or requires face-to-face instruction for students with disabilities. I know that we all know this, but sometimes I think we're going to need to remind parents or school staff or the community that there's nothing in IDEA that requires specially designed instruction to be administered face-to-face. And when I'm going to send out an email following our call today that will have links to several things, and one will be the joint letter between Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, and Office for Civil Rights, OCR, that specifically states this. I'm going to pause for a minute and check in with Sandy to see if we've got questions before I turn it over to Michelle for a minute.
We do. We have 3, and I'm going to start with the most the most recent question. It says, can or have you sent sample PWNs for the IEP addendum process? And then also in Enrich, now that we can check contingency plan, is this going to continue to be a choice for the long-term future?
So PWN, we are working on PWN samples and documentation across service delivery model samples, and we'll send those out as soon as we get them. And I'll say this, and several of you, especially my virtual charter friends, have heard this story before. My virtual or my charter friends have. I always get really nervous sending out samples. When Nicole and I were in the charter district and we first were rolling out the new Enrich system, and we had the brand new evaluation, reevaluation process in Enrich, we worked hard on sample prior written notices and evaluation reports and all these things. And I thought I was being really creative and had found a fail-safe way to send out a sample. I used names from characters from Game of Thrones, which are not typically names that we see with kids running around our state, and from Breaking Bad. We had a school that we went down to review files for, and I'll be John Brown if I didn't read an evaluation report that was copied word from our sample for Tyrion Lannister. So we will send out samples, but it will be with the disclaimer that they are samples only. They are not to be cut and pasted. They are for guidance only. Sandy, after I've gone on that tirade, remind me of what the second question was, and I apologize.
Sure. Will the contingency plans be in Enrich for the foreseeable future?
They will, and we are working to get the IEP in a better the system to be a little more flexible so that we might not need that documentation, that we might be able to at some point write an IEP that would be applicable across all the instructional delivery models. We're just not there yet. That requires a lot more coding and discussion with Enrich. I wish I could tell you that the contingency plan will be needed only for this year and never, ever again. But I can't. That will be there. There may be other situations in the future that we would need a contingency plan for, but it will remain in the IEP or accessible in the Enrich system.
So do they need to still keep a contact log like they did in the spring if they're moving to e-learning?
That's going to be up to your district and how you document contact with students. One of the questions we had is there a minimum number of contacts with students that SPED teachers have to have? And of course, the answer is always that's up to the IEP team and how services are going to be provided to the students. So start first with your district to see how your district is requiring you to document service provision and instruction to students, and then go to the IEP. So your minimum number of contacts and the way you are going to document those contacts will be determined by what all kids are going to get in the district, and then go to your IEP specific requirements. I can tell you, well, I don't think you can ever document too much. Just look at it through the lens of, if I ever have a parent that calls the State Department and says, my kid's not been getting the services in the IEP, and we call the district, what kinds of documentation would you be able to provide that shows, yes, this student did get the services as described in the IEP?
Okay, we have a couple more questions. What guidance can you provide regarding students who may be receiving home-based instruction? Parents are under the belief that if their doctors request home-based services due to COVID, then the district is obligated to send a teacher to their homes.
Great question, and I want to distinguish between home-based and medical homebound. It sounds like you're talking about medical homebound. And I should have put this in the presentation. I'll try to remember to add it to a slide. So medical homebound would not be appropriate unless the student is medically unable to access instruction the way it's being provided in the district. This is, for example, a child that's just had hip surgery and can't tolerate physically sitting up and logging into virtual instruction for 5 hours a day or whatever it's going to be. That would be a reason for medical homebound. Remember the medical homebound process. First thing that has to happen is the parent gets the doctor's recommendation, and that's what it is. It's a recommendation for medical homebound and why that student cannot participate in real instruction through any of the ways that the district's offering. The second thing that has to happen is that the superintendent of the district or his or her designee decides, yes, we'll accept that, or no, we won't. Yes, we'll approve it, or no, we won't. It's up to the district as to whether or not the medical homebound request gets approved. The other thing I'll send out is NASD has just done a nice kind of side-by-side with medical homebound and virtual instruction. And it does a good job of talking about the fact that medical homebound is only appropriate for students who, for a medical reason, cannot access instruction the way it's going to be provided by the district. So if you've got a parent that says, I want the teacher, I don't want to do virtual with my kid. And I'm not going to send him face to face. I want the teacher to have to come to my home to provide services. So I'm going to get my doctor to write a script for medical homebound. That's not appropriate for medical homebound. That goes back to an IEP team to determine the parent to make a choice. Do you want face-to-face, hybrid, or virtual? And then how is the IEP going to provide that? The parent can't use medical homebound to override the district's options of providing service. Medical homebound is when there is a medical reason the student cannot participate in instruction in any of the instructional models the district's offering.
So Becky, do speech therapists, OT, and PT need permission from parents to provide virtual services? And what about privacy concerns, confidentiality?
So here's what we found out, and we spent a lot of time trying to track this down. As you know, there's nothing in IDEA that requires consent beyond, informed parent consent beyond the initial provision of special ed services, as far as that's concerned. And a parent signs consent for special ed services. The parent doesn't sign consent for specific services or for services delivered in a certain way. The parent signs consent for the student to receive special ed services, and then the IEP team determines what those services look like. The Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation, LLR, does have a requirement that has to do with licensure and professional ethics that says OTs, PTs, and speech have to have consent from the parent for the student to receive virtual services or through a virtual format. This is something that we have just recently learned about. We are going to be in conversation with LLR. We're talking with other states to see if this is a requirement of other licensing, regulatory licensing departments in other states. We have developed a sample consent form that Barbara Drayton in our Office of General Counsel has worked with us on, that we feel like will meet the LLR requirements. We've talked about what would happen if a parent refused services through virtual format. And we'll be sending out some guidance related to that. But if the parent, for example, has chosen virtual format for instruction, and we have to remember that a parent can't pick and choose what services in the IEP he or she wants for the child. The IEP team decides that this package of services is needed in order for the student to provide FAPE. If the parent were to say, that's fine, but I don't want OT, for example, through virtual, and the IEP team has determined it would be appropriate, then the IEP team would need to look at their data to say, do we have data that supports OT needs to be provided in a different manner? If the IEP team doesn't, if the IEP team says we have our data support that we can provide services this way in a virtual format, then we'll be sending out some guidance as to how to, bottom line is we'll need to try to work it out with the parent. But we are going to send out that form in talking with, so Carmen will on our staff and Angie Neal are our OT and speech folks that are licensed under LLR. When I ask, what would happen, let's just pretend for a moment that we choose not to get consent for virtual teleservice provision. What might that look like? What could happen? Because nothing's going to happen compliance-wise with IDEA. It's not one of our requirements. And the answer is it could put the therapist's license with the state at risk if they were monitored or audited, and we don't want to do that. So even though it is not our requirement to have this consent, It is an LLR requirement, so we are going to try to help facilitate that. Again, we've developed a sample consent form that can be used. You'll keep it, or the therapist would keep it with his or her records. You can certainly upload it and enrich if you want to. As far as IDEA requirements, we are not going to be monitoring for that kind of thing.
Okay, there's just a couple of more that have come in. I think maybe answer those. So one is a little off topic, but I'm sure it'll be something that other directors are going to kind of wonder about too. The activity codes in PowerSchool changed, and I'm just trying to find Brian's email or his message really quick. He said the activity codes changed in PowerSchools, like autism is no longer an activity code, but now they have ECE special ed as a code, and they're not really sure when do they use that and how should they proceed?
That's an excellent question, and I have no idea, but we will find out that answer and get it to you. I think, I don't mean to offend anybody, but activity codes are probably one of my least favorite things to deal with. I hope there's nobody that has lots of time and effort spent into developing activity codes. I don't mean to offend anybody. I don't know the answer to that. Did not realize they had changed it, I don't think, but we will find that answer and send it out.
I think we're good.
Okay. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe.
So sorry.
That's okay.
Unmuting myself. So good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to give a few reminders about on the fiscal side. Specifically, I have been informed that several of the districts are calling concerning the recent receipt of their GANs. Just a reminder that these GANs are for partial allocation of the 611 grant. Okay, now you should have received a GAN for the full amount of the 619 because the state was awarded the full amount. However, we only received a partial allocation from the federal government for 619. So therefore, each district only received a partial allocation. We expect that in October, we'll get the remainder, and then we can go ahead and have our GANs approved through ART and get those sent out sometime in October or November. So with that in mind, you recently received a GAN for the partial or first part of your 611 allocation. So please get those signed GANs back into us by September 1st, as well as the signed GAN for the full allocation amount for 619. Just another reminder, we put this in the email to you as well, but you have two options in budgeting your funds. You can wait until you receive that second GAN in October or November and just budget your whole allocation at that time. With that, you will not be able to request reimbursement until after your budget has been put into GAPS and approved. That's the first option. With the second option, you can go ahead and budget that portion of the allocation that you just received for 611 now and wait for approval, and then you can start to request reimbursement for that once it is approved in GAPS. Again, this is only 611. You can go in to GAPS at this point and budget your full amount for 619. Wait for approval, and then you'll be able to start requesting reimbursements. Now, you can start expending funds at any time. What this will hold you up on is just requesting reimbursement. Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. Financial aid applications, just another reminder on this front, they were due August 15th, but if you haven't gotten them in, we will allow you to go ahead and get those in. And if you have any students that come in after your initial submission of financial aid applications, just a reminder that you must get the cost share application into us within 15 days of placing the student. Okay, and I think that's it for fiscal. Thank you.
All right, good deal. A couple of resources to share with you very quickly. Angie Neal and Carmen Wilm have recorded a webinar that's in two parts that have to do with related service provision, and it covers topics like safety, workload, service delivery models. We will be sending out that link following in the email that I send out with the resources, and it provides some good guidance to support the return to school this year. It'll be appropriate for physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, assistive technology specialists, interpreters, and orientation and mobility specialists. If you have any questions, Carmen and Angie will be great resources for you, and we'll send out that link. We being the Department of Ed, has launched a new social emotional learning website. I think I've sent that link out to folks. And it's a great resource. It is visually appealing. It is easy to navigate through. I tried to say the word navigable. It's easy to navigate through it. And we'll be building out more resources through this as we go. This is a great effort and cooperative effort across several different offices and divisions within the Department of Ed. But as with most things, I have to brag on our folks. Special Ed did the most work on it. That said, with a smile and a wink. Medicaid, one of my other favorite topics. Superintendent Spearman has sent a letter to the Department of Health and Human Services, where Medicaid lives, to request considerations for additional temporary waivers for service provision and reeval that have to do with virtual teleservice provision. We have requested that group teleservice provision be allowable for reimbursement under Medicaid, as well as virtual reeval components. We have also requested clarification for the 90-day progress reports to allow the IEP progress reports, which are typically done even more frequently than 90 days, to suffice for progress reports. And we have requested that face-to-face, the definition of face-to-face be broadened to include virtual Zoom meetings, Google Classroom platforms, those kinds of things. I cannot say strongly enough that another reminder that IEP teams have to make decisions based on what the student needs and not what's reimbursable by Medicaid. I think there is a Medicaid webinar that's coming out Thursday, and you will see things in there that, you can't provide services for a group of students. It has to be on an individual basis. It should be clearly stated in that if you want to be reimbursed by Medicaid, you certainly can provide services to groups of students if that's what the IEP team decides, and you cannot make a decision about service provision based on whether or not it is reimbursable by Medicaid. Just as soon as we hear from HHS, we will get back to you. We have requested that if those temporary waivers are granted, that they be retroactive back to last March. And I know I've said this to a couple of folks before, like Brian Denny, keep your fingers crossed. A couple of data reporting reminders from Carolyn. The Indicator 8 survey, which is parent involvement survey, is in progress. And actually, Carolyn, you want to do your own updates? Sorry.
I can. Just to let you guys know that the surveys for Indicator 8 have gone out. So if you were on the list to be surveyed this year, the postcards have gone out to the parents. Andrea sent a reminder out to the districts today to let them know what the survey questions are, and just a script as to why we are doing this. And also she created a flyer to send out to your parents or to the folks in your district to let them know that this survey is coming and to encourage them to participate in said survey. The other thing is Table 4, the exiting report is due on Friday, August 28th by close of business. So please, just a reminder to submit prior to then. We have noticed that Enrich is doing some crazy things, so I would recommend that you go in and test your data before Friday, just to make sure that everything is working properly and up to par. And also, there were a couple of questions about the 2021 reporting calendar, and Becky has that information to send out in her updates after this call as well. Thank you.
All right. A couple of upcoming events. We will be sending out information about New Directors Academy. It will be virtual this year, of course, as will Fall Administrators Conference. So you'll get information about these things soon. New directors will have a flipped classroom approach. So what we'll do is to send out short recorded modules to watch ahead of time, and then actually have interaction time during the Teams meeting or Zoom, whatever format we're going to use. Fall administrators, I can't give you a date at this point other than to tell you it will be October. And again, it will be virtual. Sandy, other questions at this point?
Yes, there were some questions about, it looks like Michelle already answered the questions about the 611. Otherwise, nope, there are no other questions.
All right, thank you all. I know this is an incredible time for everybody. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions or concerns. We'll do the next call. You wanted to do these every other week, so whatever 2 weeks from today is, it will be September, is about as close as I can tell you with that. And I will be sending out the email that kind of has some of the information we talked about, the links to the resources, very shortly. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and I've been able to give you 2 whole minutes back. My day is complete. Thanks all.